You're listening to Precinct 444, a podcast network from the National Law Enforcement Museum. Today we're bringing you an episode from Law and Disorder, where we dive into the world of true crime stories with memorable cases that have lasting effects for law enforcement. For today's episode, Anna Muckenfuss, our Manager of Programs and Education Initiatives, brings us the story of 4 Dead in Ohio, Kent State, 1970.
This is Law and Disorder. My name is Anna Muckenfuss, and today we will be traveling back to an era of American history where our country saw ourselves at war not only in the jungles of Vietnam, but also at home. During the Vietnam War, fathers and sons found themselves at ideological odds. Where the older generation had found themselves proud to take up arms in previous armed conflicts, most notably the fight against Nazi Germany and Japan in World War II, this younger generation found themselves subject to the first issue of the draft, conscripted to board a helicopter and dropped into a kind of battle that no amount of basic training could truly prepare them for. When the first round of soldiers came home from their tours, they were shaken and dramatically changed. Draft cards were being burnt by the thousands, and the anti-war movement was spreading across the country like wildfire, especially on college campuses. Demonstrations blossomed among American youth, and in 1970, 2 demonstrations became deadly. On May 4th, 1970, Kent State was no longer just a typical Vietnam-era college campus. It was transformed into a battlefield where an astounding tragedy would occur. By the mid-afternoon, 4 students would die, 9 would be injured, and 1 would remain paralyzed from the waist down for the rest of his life. A place where students would normally walk to class would be covered in pools of the dark red blood of innocent anti-war protesters. A second deadly demonstration, organized in response to students' outrage over the Kent State killings, occurred on May 15, 1970, at what is now known as Jackson State University in Jackson, Mississippi, then known as Jackson State College. Similar in circumstance, the demonstration resulted in the deaths of 2 additional students, Philip L. Gibbs, a 21-year-old junior, and James Earl Green, a 17-year-old senior from the nearby Jim Hill High School, and it injured 12 additional protesters. We will not go through the timeline of the Jackson State killings on today's episode just because we don't have the time to give it the justice it deserves. But it is very important to recognize these victims of the Jackson State incident, as their presence at this demonstration and the demonstration in and of itself happened because of the incident at Kent State. Jackson State is also worth mentioning, as its investigation walked hand in hand with that of Kent State, as they were both key events that led to the creation of the President's Commission on Campus Unrest, assembled by President Richard Nixon to more fully understand the scope of student unrest over the conflict in Vietnam at American universities. We will discuss the Scranton Commission, as it came to be known, toward the end of this episode. But to truly understand the effects of the massacre on that fateful Monday afternoon, we must first travel back a few short days to April 30th, 1970, when a television broadcast by the President of the United States would change the dynamic of an entire country. It is Thursday, April 30th, 1970. After his election in November of 1968, boasting the promises of ending the war in Vietnam, President Richard M. Nixon has been in the White House for 16 months. At 9:00 p.m., President Nixon goes on live television from the White House to relay an urgent message upon the American people. In his 22-minute address, Nixon announces the invasion of Cambodia by American and South Vietnamese troops in an attempt to liberate the country from the iron grip of North Vietnamese communism. Throughout the speech, Nixon refers to a large map of the war-torn region, repeatedly addressing outlined communist sanctuaries lying along the shared border of Cambodia and America's ally, South Vietnam. According to President Nixon, invading Cambodia is crucial to the United States' success in this conflict against Vietnam. President Nixon states, "We take this action not for the purpose of expanding the war into Cambodia, but for the purpose of ending the war in Vietnam and winning the just peace we all desire." The president carries on with his speech. Every few moments, he rises from the desk and paces toward a map of Cambodia with the known communist-occupied territories marked in red. He describes Cambodia's pleas to the United States for military assistance and acknowledges that his decision to help this helpless country will probably cost him his second term in the White House. With a plea for the American people to support the GIs in Vietnam and now Cambodia, he bids the American people goodnight and ends his broadcast. As he signs off, the president could not know that events charged by outrage over his announcement at a university in Northeast Ohio would begin his further descent into paranoia, eventually leading to Watergate and then culminating in his resignation. At the conclusion of Nixon's speech, college students, especially across the country, were outraged, and Kent Staters were no different, as a feeling of betrayal fell over campuses across the country. Many students felt that the war in Vietnam was unjust, and those old enough to vote in the 1968 election had chosen Nixon, elated by his commitment to bring the GIs home and end the conflict. But after this 22-minute address, it was very clear to even the youngest of Nixon supporters that the man they trusted with their vote had lied to them. The war, which already seemed as if it was never going to end, had now become even longer. The following day at Kent State, a horde of irate students gathered upon the Commons, a grassy area below Taylor Hall, used as a common outdoor meeting place. The time is noon, and the day is Friday, May 1st. Towering above the mob of students, with a bullhorn in his hand, is a history graduate student named Steve Sheriff. His bushy dark hair and long, lean figure command attention as he stands over this crowd. Often regarded by his peers as a take charge kind of fellow who could send good shivers down the spines of young sorority girls, it would be no surprise to the student body that this vivacious anti-war intellectual would be leading a rally such as this. For at this particular rally, a copy of the United States Constitution would be buried. It was a young history buff named Chris Plant who helped Sheriff to come up with the idea of burying a copy of the document. The two young men had stayed up all night after Nixon's address, crafting flyers and painting signs on sidewalks. By noon, a female student had even torn a copy of the document from her textbook specifically for the occasion. At the rally, Sheriff made his opening remarks in his usual style, and then turned the mic over to a former chemistry instructor named Bob Franklin. Franklin really had a way of stirring up a crowd. Standing atop of the Victory Bell on the edge of the Commons, he was dressed in army green fatigues, with a matching cap and a cigar butt sticking out of his disheveled beard. He boasted to the crowd, "This is my Castro outfit," in reference to Cuban dictator Fidel Castro, a popular figure among a fringe of anti-war protesters. This comment earned a boisterous cheer from his audience. Speeches began in order to rally the Assembly of Co-eds around their common sentiment. They believed President Nixon had murdered the United States Constitution when he sent troops into Cambodia, so they were all there to give the document a proper burial. Sheriff dug a hole near the base of the Victory Bell, threw the document into the ground, and covered it with the dark earth while demonstrators cheered him on. During the excitement, word spread, encouraging students to congregate later that evening in downtown Kent. It was a Friday night, after all. Another protester cried out, "Shall we meet again to plan a real anti-war organization?" The question was followed by a chorus of approving cheers. The Constitution's gravediggers joined into their excited chants. Monday at noon, and it had been settled. The assembly of students parted and moved on to attend their next classes for the day, content in their plan to further their protests both later that night and again on Monday. At 11:30 p.m. on the evening of May 1st, students of Kent State made their way to the downtown area of Kent, a college town just outside of Cleveland, Ohio. These students, some of which had been drinking at the local bars, began to assemble in the street, and what started as a demonstration quickly edged into a riot. A bonfire was started in the middle of town, and demonstrators flocked toward the flames like moths to a lamp. Around this blaze, activists chanted anti-war slogans, further exciting the group. And the pack of demonstrators then made their way through town, smashing 47 storefront windows, swinging from stoplights at intersections, and harassing Kent locals with destructive anti-war sentiments. A student threw a beer at a police car as a number of violent brawls broke out between students and the local townies. The anti-war militant group, Students for a Democratic Society, led the further terrorizing of buildings like the gas company and those for other utilities because they were associated with the quote-unquote establishment. While downtown, police arrested 14 students and worked to push the more reasonable student activists back toward the university's campus. But just across town, Kent's mayor, Leroy Satram, is in a panic over the commotion students are causing in his usually calm city. He calls for a state of emergency to be declared in the city of Kent, and that a dawn-to-dusk curfew be strictly enforced. Mayor Satram had never been shy about publicizing his disapproval of the anti-war youth and their activities at the university that called the sleepy town of Kent, Ohio, home. Mayor Satram wants nothing more than to teach these kids a lesson, so he rings the only man he knows who can extinguish the problems in his town, Ohio Governor James Rhodes. Governor Rhodes is a no-nonsense man, and anti-war protesters, especially violent, destructive ones, can bring national publicity, and if he lets them get away with this kind of behavior, he could lose voters and his office. He has to respond correctly, and in a way that means business, while also cleaning up this huge smudge that casts a stain over the wholesome image of his great Midwestern state. Excessive force is his choice, and he knows the perfect men to call upon for this cleanup: the Ohio National Guard. For Governor Rhodes, calling upon the Ohio National Guard was nothing new, for he'd called upon these men in uniform more times than all of the Ohio governors in the state's history. With the governor putting the National Guard on alert, Mayor Satram knew he could rest easily that night, thinking that the issue in his sleepy college town would be swiftly resolved. But on Saturday, after hearing of the previous evening's events through the news outlets, out-of-state students began arriving on the Kent State campus to join in on the students' protest. Hot on their trails were both the Ohio State Patrol and the Ohio National Guardsmen. Representatives of both agencies had been ordered onto campus by Governor Rhodes and Mayor Satram in order to quell the fear that the Kent State officials would not be able to hold off the potential level of destruction that young revolutionaries were likely to conjure in the coming days. Mayor Satram wrote to the commander of the Ohio National Guard troops early on Saturday, May 2nd, pleading for their assistance. He stated, "Local law enforcement agencies can no longer cope with the situation, and I instruct you to provide the necessary assistance to restore peace and order to our community." Later that day, to the surprise of Kent State University administration and the local police department, uniformed Ohio National Guardsmen began to file on campus, wielding their M1 rifles. Authorities reached out to the mayor for an explanation, and he made it very clear that the guardsmen were there to stay until the threat of anti-war protest was extinguished. These uniformed visitors to the Kent State campus were not a welcome sight to students with anti-war sentiments, and they decided to take a stand later that night. At 8:00 p.m., a flock of anti-war students descended through the Kent State campus toward the Commons, irate over the mayor and governor's assembly of National Guardsmen on their campus. Anti-war chants echoed through campus as protesters began to close in on their target, Kent State's old ROTC building. The ROTC building was fairly plain, a repurposed World War II barrack that had served as the campus's ROTC headquarters since its decommissioning after the war. In comparison to the rather picturesque brick buildings on campus, the ROTC headquarters was very humble in appearance, but it successfully served its purpose of housing the armory between drills and acting as a meeting place for ROTC members and their instructors. The small structure was dwarfed by the crowd of over 1,000 protesters that swarmed it on that Saturday night. A shower of rocks began to pelt at the building's windows, followed closely by Molotov cocktails, lighted railroad flares, and other projectiles. It was very clear that this demonstration was not meant to be peaceful. For 30 to 45 minutes, the students' assault of the building carried on. Eventually, one student managed to catch a curtain inside of the building alight, and at 8:45 p.m., the building started to burn while the crowd cheered. Gazing proudly upon their work, from the crest of Blanket Hill and the Commons to the tune of the rhythmic chants of anti-war sentiments. By 9 p.m., a chorus of sirens began to fill the air as the first engines from the Kent Fire Department came onto the scene, attempting to extinguish the blaze, which had ignited the horizon with a brilliant orange flame. Protesters were not about to allow the establishment to end their display of pyrotechnics without a fight, and began furiously attacking these firefighters. Protesters began hitting firemen, climbing onto their backs, throwing rocks and bottles, and even hacking at fire hoses with pocket knives. The violence was effective to the protesters' cause, as it did make the firemen retreat back to the station, leaving the building to continue to burn. But to the students' dismay, despite the fire department's departure, the fire was beginning to subside on its own. Then there was a great explosion and a reprise of cheers. The live ammunition stored inside the building began to explode and caused the blaze to grow. About an hour after the inferno at the ROTC building began, the Ohio National Guard was now fully assembled on campus. Guardsmen rounded up the retreated firemen and brought them back to the scene of the blaze, instructing them to continue quelling the now re-enraged fire. Campus police donned riot gear, and members of the National Guard began taking measures to disperse the crowd that had formed, lobbing tear gas canisters toward the rioting students. This seemed to be effective, as the crowd began to retreat in the direction of nearby tennis courts, and the troopers advanced behind the students, pressing them further back off of the commons. Sunday morning began fairly quietly. Ohio National Guardsmen began cleaning up the devastation caused during the last night's events at the site of the ROTC building, which was now a scorched shell of a structure. In the ruins, guardsmen find the charred remains of rifles, ammunition, and other military supplies from the armory. Almost everything left behind by the blaze was unsalvageable, amounting to nearly $86,000 worth of damage caused by the student revolutionaries on that Saturday night alone. Then, the governor arrived to Kent State's campus. He toured the desolation left at the ROTC building's former site and declared the scene at Kent as the worst violence in the state of Ohio. He promised to crack down on the individuals involved in the anti-war activities, and later that day in a press conference, Governor Rhodes would warn the public about the student insurgents, stating, "I think we're up against the strongest, well-trained military revolutionary group in America." And he even referred to rioting students as worse than the brown shirts and the communist element. But he assured the members of the Kent community of his determination to end the violence and unrest on the Kent State campus, saying, "We're going to eradicate the problem. We're not going to treat the symptoms." The visit from Governor Rhodes and his statements comparing radicals to communists and Nazis had an inflammatory effect on the state of unrest on the Kent State campus. And around 11 p.m. on Sunday, groups of enraged students began to congregate themselves on the front campus and sat in the road, blocking traffic on the corner of Main and Lincoln Streets. The demonstrators began to curse the guardsmen, throw rocks, sing John Lennon's "Give Peace a Chance," in harmony with a rotation of anti-war chants. Guardsmen in full riot gear began to close in on the students. At the direction of Governor Rhodes, guardsmen were instructed to enforce an immediate and strict curfew on the Kent State campus. The demonstrating students were not willing to comply. Similar to the night before, guardsmen utilized tear gas in an attempt to disperse the crowd, and about 300 students retreated back to the Tri-Towers, a trio of dormitories on campus. But many of the demonstrating students did not budge. They required guardsmen to make the decision to use even greater methods of force than tear gas. With their M1 rifles in hand, the guardsmen secured their bayonets and began to push the crowd further back toward campus. Facing this increase in force, the remaining students reluctantly complied. During the pushback onto campus, guardsmen bayoneted multiple students, and 51 people were arrested. The most common charge among the arrested was the breaking of curfew. The rest of the evening was quiet, but the real noise wouldn't be made until the following day at noon. It is Monday, May 4th, 1970. The day is one typical of springtime in the Midwest. Wind rustles the leaves on the trees and blows through the long hair of protesting students who are assembling around the Victory Bell on the Commons. It is about 11 o'clock, an hour before the anti-war protest is set to begin. Among the protesters is a young Jeffrey Miller. The extroverted fellow stands with a fairly small stature and is casually dressed in a white cowboy shirt and well-worn jeans. His dark hair falls almost to his shoulders, and he wears an Indian headband just above his brow. Mr. Miller is only 20 years old on this day in May. He hails from Plainview, New York, and is a junior in college. He has only been at Kent State since January. He transferred from Michigan State. He's known around campus as a kind, helpful, and gregarious young man. Yet Jeffrey Miller is still kind of unsure of himself. He's especially insecure around girls his age, once telling a friend, "I know a dozen girls I'd like to ask for a date, but I'm sure they'd all turn me down." He was unconfident around girls and unsure of how he felt about the war in Vietnam, but there he was, standing on the Commons, just another face in this crowd on the 4th day of May. Around this same time, a young 19-year-old freshman named Allison Krause is hurrying her boyfriend Barry Levine. Miss Krause has been against the war in Vietnam since she was in high school, and her opposition to the war has only grown in her time at Kent State. She is known around campus for her feisty personality and her willingness to voice her opinions. Her long dark hair falls below her shoulders, and she's wearing a faded green military jacket over a gray shirt with Kennedy written across her chest. Her tall, slim figure makes her fairly easy to pick out from a crowd, and she and Barry make their way toward the Commons, where the noon rally is about to take place. They assemble on the crest of Blanket Hill with the rest of their student protesters and begin chanting anti-war sentiments with their comrades. The hilly terrain around the Commons is stacked full of spectators watching the dramatic scene unfold. They patiently watch as Troop G, Charlie Company, and Company A of the Ohio National Guard assemble a skirmish line among the charred remains of the ROTC building. An armored jeep carrying 2 Ohio National Guardsmen, a driver, and a Kent State police officer, Harold E. Rice, drives across the Commons toward the demonstrating students. Officer Rice calls through a bullhorn, "This assembly is unlawful. This crowd must disperse immediately. This is an order." The students addressed this military jeep with everything from catcalls and cursing to a hail shower of rocks. The jeep retreats back to the remains of the ROTC building and the skirmish line. Precisely at 11:59 a.m., General Robert H. Canterbury of the Ohio National Guard ordered his men, stating, "Prepare to move out and disperse this mob." But before General Canterbury could even order his men to march, a student spokesman approached the general, stating, "General, you must not march against these students." To which Canterbury replied, "These students are going to have to find out what law and order is all about." And at the general's order, the men of the Ohio National Guard begin to cross the Commons toward the group of assembled students. The guardsmen, donning gas masks, begin to launch canisters of tear gas into the crowd of rioters as an attempt to encourage them to disperse. However, due to the high winds of this spring day, the tear gas had a less than desired effect. Some of the more experienced and ruthless assemblers, armed with pieces of cloth and bottles of water, began to snatch up the tear gas canisters, lobbing them back into the direction of the approaching guardsmen, while others threw rocks. Many students, like Jeffrey Miller, continued chanting anti-war sentiments toward the guardsmen and extending their middle fingers, among other lewd gestures, but did not participate in the throwing of tear gas canisters back toward the guardsmen. The guardsmen continued their advance toward the hill. and in fear that the guardsmen were wielding bayonets like they had the night before, many of the students started their retreat up the crest of Blanket Hill and around Taylor Hall, near a practice field and the Prentice Hall parking lot, another dorm on campus. As the students retreated, the guardsmen followed them to assure that they had effectively cleared everyone from the commons and the side of Blanket Hill. Troop G and Charlie Company swung around the right side of Taylor Hall and created a skirmish line next to the cement Oriental Pagoda statue neighboring the building, while A Company trailed groups of students along the left side of the building, creating their own skirmish line between Taylor and Prentice Halls, as well as blocking any entrance to the commons from that side of the building. This created an effective perimeter, blocking students from re-entering the commons from the other side of Taylor Hall. With their high vantage point, guardsmen watched as retreating students made their way back to their dormitories and toward their 1 p.m. classes. Some students, not intending to end their protest without a fight, persisted in their assault of guardsmen by throwing rocks, chanting loudly, and raising lewd gestures, aiming most of their protests towards the guardsmen assembled near the pagoda. One student protester, Alan Canfora, waved a black flag in protest of the guardsmen's presence. Onlookers turned their cameras to get the perfect shot of the guardsmen watching over the retreating students and the few remaining active protesters. At exactly 12:24 p.m., Troop G and Charlie Company reeled, took their aim, and fired a total of 67 rounds in 13 seconds toward the group of retreating students in the Prentice Hall parking lot, unprompted by any order from a commanding officer. 13 seconds doesn't seem like it would be a long time, but it felt like an eternity. Students immediately dropped to the ground, leapt behind and underneath parked cars, and ran for their lives. And then a stunned silence fell over the crowd. Then all that could be heard were the shocked screams of agony from the parking lot. Shot through the mouth and killed upon impact, the body of Jeffrey Miller was lying in a massive pool of his own blood. He was standing only 225 feet away from the skirmish line when he was hit, fleeing from the scene with fellow co-eds as the fatal bullet struck him. His body was lying so still as the crimson blood gushed from his wound onto the ground. Students near his body froze, staring at the traumatic image in front of him. A 14-year-old runaway named Marianne Vecchio knelt next to the body and let out a loud cry, calling for someone to help the young man who was bleeding on the ground. A photojournalism major named John Philo would capture this moment on his film camera and earn the Pulitzer Prize for an image he titled Anguish. Only a few yards away lies the body of William Schroeder. A bullet struck him in his lower back and exploded through his right shoulder as he dove for cover. As he lies bleeding on the ground, immense blood loss is causing him to quickly fade near a state of unconsciousness, but he weakly calls for an ambulance. He was referred to as the All-American Boy by his friends and family. Schroeder was a 19-year-old sophomore and an active member of the ROTC battalion on campus. He was an Eagle Scout by the age of 17 and had been a basketball star at his high school in Lorain, Ohio. Bill Schroeder was a good-looking young man, described by one of his close friends as the perfect Nordic. He stood at 6 feet tall with an athletic figure, clear blue eyes, even features, and an effortless smile. He was not involved in the noon rally, but simply walking between classes. He was even shot with his folders in his hands. In the course of an hour, he would be picked up by an ambulance and rushed to the hospital, where he would pass while undergoing emergency surgery. Sandra Scheuer and her friend had just made it to the scene of the protest as it was scheduled to begin at noon. While her roommate, Jan Reinstein, and another friend left the rally just as the guardsmen began lobbing tear gas at the mass of protesters, Sandy decided she'd stick around with a couple of her other friends, and together they retreated into Johnson Hall to wait for the tear gas to clear. Eventually, Sandy decided she'd had enough of the protest and decided to just head to her 1:10 p.m. class a bit early, sensing that the retreat of students meant that most of the activity was coming to a close. Her friend Ellis Burns saw her as she was walking through a crowd on the way to class, struggling to clear the streaming from her eyes that was caused by the tear gas in the air. Ellis gave her a piece of the rag he had used to cover his face and began to walk with her to class when they heard a rapping noise behind them. They turned to see what was happening. Ellis turned to pull Sandy toward him and toward one of the parked cars, but the pair hit the ground before they could even reach it. After the firing had stopped, Ellis said, "Let's go," but Sandy didn't move. A bullet had hit her in the neck, and she died only moments later from blood loss. Allison Krauss and Barry Levine had retreated as the guardsmen had begun their advance. As the pair began to cross the Prentice Hall parking lot, Barry got a glimpse of the guardsmen as they knelt and took their fire. Thinking quickly, he called out to Allison to get down, and the pair knelt behind a parked car. After the shooting stopped, Barry congratulated himself for his quick thinking, the belief that he had saved both his and Allison's lives in those few seconds. But then Allison whispered, "Barry, I'm hit." And Barry could hardly process the 3 words she'd uttered. As he looked her up and down, not seeing any wounds or blood, he thought she had been mistaken. Then she said again, "Barry, I'm hit." And that was when he saw the blood coloring the shirt and her jacket from beneath her arm. He quickly began to shout for an ambulance. It felt like an eternity passed before the ambulance arrived, and as EMTs loaded Allison into the back, Barry climbed in with her, but shortly upon their arrival to the hospital, he was shooed away. He retreated to the waiting room, where he would sit for hours. He tries to ask hospital staff about Allison's condition, but since he's not qualified as her next of kin, they can tell him nothing. He asks if her parents have been contacted, but they only tell him that phone lines have been down and they'll contact her next of kin as soon as they're back working again. Eventually, hospital staff tell him he just needs to go back to campus, but he remains in the waiting room, hoping that someone would look past his long hair and scruffy beard and tell him whether or not Allison was okay. While being treated for a gunshot wound to the wrist, fellow student revolutionary Alan Canfora, the same demonstrator who had waved a black flag during the protest earlier that day, saw Barry as he was leaving the hospital, distraught and defeated with no news about Allison's condition. He worried Allison's parents would not even know of their daughter's condition until she was already gone. Back on Kent State's campus, injured and uninjured students alike were in shock at the scene that laid out before them. Freshman architecture student John Cleary was laid out on the ground. He had been struck in the chest by a bullet after it pierced through the metal totem statue in front of Taylor Hall. He had been hit while attempting to snap one last photograph of the guardsmen of Charlie Company and Troop G in formation near the pagoda. A flock of students rushed to Cleary's side to perform first aid until an ambulance could come and take him to the hospital. As injured students like John Cleary were being loaded into ambulances and taken to Ravenna Hospital in downtown Kent, uninjured students had begun to reassemble themselves again on Blanket Hill, demonstrating their outrage over the Ohio National Guard's firing of live ammunition, their opposition to the Vietnam War now temporarily placed on the back burner. Immediately after the firing stopped, the guardsmen retreated back to the Commons and headed toward the ruins of the ROTC building. Faculty marshals began to attempt breaking up the commotion, and it was diplomacy between faculty and guardsmen who ultimately diffused the situation on the Commons that afternoon. Professor Glenn Frank made a beeline to the General Canterbury, pleading with him to prevent any further assaults on the students. He then turned to the mass of students, quickly gaining control of the crowd. Strong emotion and panic was apparent in his voice when he said to the mass, "I don't care if you've never listened to anyone before in your lives. I am begging you right now. If you don't disperse right now, they're going to move in, and it can only be a slaughter. Would you please listen to me?" His anguished tone caused a hush over the crowd, and the simple speech he made gave the angry students enough reason to move away from the scene in small groups. Almost immediately after the murders took place, the university closed. The incident occurred around the time of midterm exams, halfway through an academic quarter. Despite students' departure from campus, many professors corresponded with their students and arranged for the completion of courses by mail, allowing those who were eligible a chance to still graduate on time, and allowing for students to seek comfort from familiar colleagues, from faculty members who were all grieving this tragic incident that had happened just outside their doors. Parents from all over the country hopped into their cars and swarmed into the city of Kent with the fear that their students could be wounded or dead. They arrived, and powder that had been expelled from the tear gas canisters still lingered on the leaves of trees, and with every gust of wind, people's eyes would begin to water. The next day, Tuesday, May 5th, martial law was instated in the city of Kent, Ohio. This outlawed any and all demonstrations and protests. Parents of Kent State students continued to flood the small college town, eager to meet with their children to make certain that they were unharmed. Phone lines had been down since the moment of the shooting, meaning that many parents were not alerted to the situation on campus until they watched the news that evening. Allison Krause's parents called the university from their home in Philadelphia as soon as they could get through. Administrators assured them that no one had been harmed in the events that had taken place earlier that day. But the next day, they would receive word that their beloved daughter Allison had been killed during the previous day's events, and they would have to travel to Kent to identify her body. The university contacted them late on Tuesday afternoon, over 24 hours after the shooting had taken place. Mr. Krause would eventually make a statement to the press. On May 4th, 1970, Sandra Scheuer's parents were celebrating their 27th anniversary, not knowing that their daughter was killed simply while leaving a demonstration and walking to class. They would find out about Sandy's death by simply calling her house and speaking to one of her roommates. It was Jan Reinstein who informed Mrs. Scheuer that her daughter was in the hospital and they should arrive to Kent as quickly as possible. She and her husband would identify Sandra's body at Ravenna Memorial Hospital less than 2 hours after that phone call. For Jeffrey Miller's parents, the story is not much different. Mrs. Elaine Miller called her son's house after hearing a report of the events on campus on the television. "Is Jeff there?" she would ask his roommate. And struck with grief, the roommate could only sputter out, "He's dead." Jeffrey Miller had called his mother on Monday morning, only 2 hours before his death, and said, "Don't worry, Mom. I'm not going to get hurt. You know me. I won't get that involved." It would be William Schroeder's roommates who were the first to hear of his fate. News outlets had reported the death of a William Snyder in the incident at Kent, but as the 5 p.m. curfew approached in Bill Schroeder's house on Franklin Street, his 4 roommates began to suspect that William Snyder might have been a misnomer and may in fact be their friend. Around 5:15, Bill's friend Gene called the house, announcing to the 4 young men living there that he'd seen their roommate shot, but only injured. An hour later, one of his roommates was at the county morgue, identifying William Schroeder's body. His parents would not even hear of the shooting on the Kent State campus until a Cleveland reporter called their house to ask if their son had been killed. And it was only after a suggestion from the Lorain, Ohio police that the Schroeders would call the Ravenna hospital and hear the news of their son's death directly. Bill's mother, especially, was crushed. She was extraordinarily close with her son, and he was taken from her simply because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Grief-stricken parents would make statements to the press in the wake of their mourning as an attempt to commemorate their slain children. Arthur Krause stated in a live television broadcast the day after her murder, she resented being called a bum because she disagreed with someone else's opinion. She felt that our crossing into Cambodia was wrong. So is this dissent a crime? Is this a reason for killing her? Have we come to such a state in this country that a young girl has to be shot because she disagrees deeply with the actions of her government? The families would soon file wrongful death suits against Ohio government officials. Including Governor James Rhodes and members of the Ohio National Guard. An FBI investigation would be held regarding the incident on May 4th, and it would try to answer the questions, which guardsman shot which student, and were the guardsmen ever ordered to fire? The question of which individual guardsman fired the fatal shots remains unanswered to this day. However, it was concluded that the guardsmen had never received a direct order to fire upon the crowd of students. The events at Kent State would inspire a number of protests on other college campuses throughout the country, including that fatal incident at Jackson State University that I mentioned in Jackson, Mississippi. This would result in the death of the one university student and high school senior who lived near the campus and joined the protest, and it would injure nearly 12 additional demonstrators. The events of student unrest at Kent State and the subsequent deadly protest at Jackson State inspired both a national student strike on campuses across the country, but not only inspired. The events of student unrest at Kent State and the subsequent deadly protest at Jackson State inspired both a national student strike on campuses across the country and the assembly of the President's Commission on Campus Unrest. This was assembled by President Nixon in order to study the dissent, disorder, and violence that was breaking out on college and university campuses and eventually resulted in the student strike. President Nixon appointed former Governor of Pennsylvania, William Scranton, to chair this committee. Thus, this is why we refer to it as the Scranton Commission. When the commission issued its findings in September of 1970, they concluded that the shooting at Kent State was unjustified. It even stated, even if the guardsmen faced danger, it was not a danger that called for lethal force. The shots by 28 guardsmen certainly cannot be justified. Apparently, no order to fire was given, and there was inadequate fire control discipline on Blanket Hill. The Kent State tragedy must mark the last time that, as a matter of course, loaded rifles are issued to guardsmen confronting student demonstrators. The study also led to the conclusion that a deeply rooted sentiment among anti-war protesters was the fact that while young American men were required to submit themselves to the selective service at the age of 18 and be enrolled in the draft, the age to vote was 21. Male students were especially irritated by this, as they felt the government considered them old enough to die for their country, but too young to have a say in its governance. Because of this new understanding of the anti-war movement, the work of the Scranton Commission helped pave the way toward ratification of the 26th Amendment to the Constitution, and in 1971, the voting age was reduced to 18. The story of the massacre at Kent State lives on through academia and pop culture. Countless books and plays have been published about Kent State and the massacre on the 4th of May, 1970. The heart-wrenching image of a young Mary Vecchio crying out for help over the slain body of Jeffrey Miller, depicted in John Philo's Pulitzer Prize-winning Anguish, immortalizes the tragedy as it hangs in museums, was published in many catalogs, and printed in countless history books, describing in black and white imagery the devastating consequences of campus unrest's most fatal moments. Kent State University teaches classes on the events of May 4th, 1970, and even constructed a memorial and visitor center with artifacts, photographs, and video footage of the day that the 1960s died on the campus. An archive is created in the university's library, which houses photographs, articles, press releases, and other information on the killings at Kent State and the individuals involved in every aspect of the day's activities. Much of it is even available on the public domain with the university's website. I even used archived digital copies of the campus's newspaper, the Kent Stater, in writing this episode. Groups like the May 4th Coalition continue to lead commemoration events every year on the Kent State campus in order to pay tribute to the students that fell there. Films and documentaries continue to educate the public of the events at Kent State and their greater significance to not only the period of campus unrest and the anti-war movement in the Vietnam War era, but the rest of American history as a whole. Songs would be written by notable artists in reaction to the horror that occurred at a university that seemed to be in a sleepy Ohio town. The Beach Boys mentioned the slaughter at Kent State in their song Student Demonstration Time from their 1971 album Surf's Up. Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young's Ohio plays a deafening testament to the slaying of Alison Krauss, Sandra Scheuer, Jeffrey Miller, and William Schroeder. The song remains a pinnacle of protest genre music from the 1970s era of student unrest. Lyrics of pain and anger act as a call to arms, as well as a warning to those opposed to the war in Vietnam. These lines calling out to the masses, "What if you knew her and found her dead on the ground? How can you run when you know?" These lyrics caused young people around the world, both in 1971 and today, to really think about the effect that violence has not only on those who pay the ultimate price of their lives, but also the effect that it has on the living. The song continues to be covered by modern artists to this day and still paints that equally haunting picture. Your confident, brilliant, and unique girlfriend who loves her strangely named pet cat could be Alison Krauss. The young student protesting for his rights on your campus could be like Jeffrey Miller. The quiet girl sitting next to you in your history lecture could be Sandra Scheuer. And the good-looking ROTC battalion boy wearing his uniform to class could be William Schroeder. Any college student anywhere could be like the Kent State Four. These Kent State Four and other injured students on that spring morning were just like any of the other students on the Kent State campus that day. They were exercising their constitutional right to assemble. They were walking to class. They were chatting with their friends. They were standing empty-handed as college students, and for that they were slain. This has been another episode of Law and Disorder, and we hope you'll join us for our next episode.
Thanks to Anna Muckenfoos for writing, researching, and sharing today's program, and to Christopher Mitchell, our Manager of Digital Content and Strategy, for producing. And many thanks to you for listening to this episode of Law and Disorder, a Precinct 444 podcast from the National Law Enforcement Museum. We hope you enjoyed this episode and will join us again for another story of law and disorder. Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. And we would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 E Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Find us online at lawenforcementmuseum.org and stay tuned for more podcast content from Precinct 444. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the precinct.